Hey, if I asked you, what's that game series from Japan with the niche cult following in the States? I'm sure you'd probably be able to come up with quite the list. However, if we were to specify and ask, what's that series with the over-the-top combat that started out on home consoles before making way too many portable releases until they eventually returned to revamp the series with major updates, finally landing them a major success for Western audiences? Well, we could still find a fair amount of games that fall under this umbrella, but today I'm specifically talking about Armored Core and Monster Hunter. Now, when I ask the question of, should Armored Core 6 be more like Monster Hunter World, I don't mean any of the core mechanics that make the game what they are. Instead, this is going to be about how the various titles have been handled over the years and how Armored Core could have done better to retain its player base after launch. This next part's not necessarily integral for the video, so I'll leave a timestamp if you want to skip it, but for some background, growing up, I played the original Monster Hunter on PS2 when I was still in elementary school, which feels weird saying now, but back then, I was immediately hooked and tried my best to keep up with the series over the years. This usually meant that I'd be playing the various titles on my PSP or 3DS, and while it did eventually return to the Wii with Monster Hunter Tri, it was still impossible for me to convince most of my friends with the Wii to even give the game a chance. Now, as for Armored Core, I'm not a started with the original veteran like I was with Monster Hunter. One fateful day during my little brother and I's routine, we beat games, need new games, runs to GameStop, I discovered Armored Core 4 for dirt cheap. I mean like less than $5 cheap. So between awoken memories of custom Robo, Virtual On at the arcade, and watching Gundam Wing on Toonami, I decided to give this low risk to my trade-in budget game a chance, and I'm so glad I did. The sheer scale and depth of how much you could do with customization had me simultaneously in awe and overwhelmed. Though this didn't stop me from making my own assortments of builds. Looking back, I can't even imagine how bad some of these loadouts were, but I still managed to push through and beat the game. However, like Monster Hunter, this was a case of, no matter how I presented this to my friends, it just never hooked them like it did me. Now from here, I didn't really stick with the series like I did with Monster Hunter, unfortunately. My household growing up typically had a rule of selling the current console to help upgrade to our next one, because at the time, we just thought of the previous gen as obsolete if it meant that we got the current system. Between this and family matters, the PSP and 360 didn't have much time for me to go all in on the Armored Core series before they were essentially unavailable to me. I wouldn't own another home console until I moved out and could afford my very own PS4, and by that point, Armored Core wasn't really a thing. Though, like Monster Hunter, it was a series that I had always hoped would finally get another home console release that would give the franchises some resurgence, and though they released almost 6 years apart, they both eventually came through in the end, with Monster Hunter World at the beginning of 2018 and Armored Core 6 at the end of 2023. But we'll get back to that later. Now, the full decade mecha lovers did not have any portable releases or even JP exclusives to hold them over like Monster Hunter did. The closest thing we got in the States was FromSoft's Metal Wolf Chaos DX in 2019, and that was just a re-release of a 15-year-old game that was supposed to be available for us in 2004, but that's a discussion for a different video. Instead, let's refocus by looking back at the franchises before their home console hiatus. Now, if we set aside the weird transitions Monster Hunter does between home and portable consoles, the approach these two franchises take with their mainline games was actually fairly similar for a time. First, they create a foundation with the base title. Then they drop another title that was basically an updated version of that first game with additional content and sometimes mechanics. However, these weren't necessarily their attempt at the next generation of the series. For an example, let's take a look at how both games handled their first release and subsequent games within that generation. Armored Core released in Japan on July 10th, 1997, before, impressively, that same year they dropped Armored Core Project Phantasma on December 4th, which was a standalone expansion to the original. A little over a year later, they released another standalone expansion called Master of Arena, which was the last installment for this generation. Monster Hunter released in Japan on March 11th, 2004, before they too impressively dropped Monster Hunter G, a standalone expansion to the original, on January 20th of that following year. December 1st of that same year, Monster Hunter Portable came out, which was not a direct port, but another expansion upon the original, despite coming out on the PSP. As both the franchises continued to evolve and develop more games, they both roughly followed this recipe, and for that time, it was probably the best way to handle keeping the game updated in some regard. It was usually worth the amount of content packed in, but to me, it always felt strange that even as we got into the 2010s, that this was still how both companies were handling things. Armored Core 5 was followed up with Verdict Day, while Monster Hunter 3, or Try, was followed up with 3 Ultimate, which wasn't even on the same console. You either had to go out of your way to buy or already own a 3DS and or the unfortunate Wii U.
That is until Capcom decided to shake up the formula with Monster Hunter World.
Oh, what a blessing this game is. To this day, I personally have not experienced another title that has handled the aftercare of a player base as well as this one has. And if the brief gushing and breakdown that's about to commence is not enough to convince you, maybe the concurrent players and viewer base on Twitch being higher than the most recent release, Monster Hunter Rise, will. Now, before I go all in, I have to point out that I understand these games are two very different beasts, who started out on much different footing, which is why I emphasized earlier that this really wasn't about the core gameplay. Aside from the spin-offs, Monster Hunter has always been a hub for you and other people to meet up and slay giant beasts, while Armored Core, though having some co-op available since To Another Age, has predominantly been a single-player focus with PvP available for those who'd like to go head-to-head in the arena. But what made Monster Hunter World so beloved, and how did it keep this retention? Well, it gave you reasons to come back to the game, and while I think the majority of its retention is due to the quality multiplayer experience, even if you are more of a solo player, we were getting constant free updates to the game to keep you invested. Whether it was PTSD from the Devil Joe, getting challenge missions that reward you with unique gear, collaborations with franchises like Final Fantasy and The Witcher giving us brand new enemies to face with unique fight mechanics, or introducing a brand new category of quests called Sieges where you had to rely on not only your party, but the other parties around the world, pun not intended, to successfully take out the Call of Teroth, rewarding you with new and hybrid versions of weapons and materials for 5 different armor sets, and this is just base game updates. Would the game still have been a good time to replay with friends even without these updates? Most definitely, and though I don't think it would have necessarily faded into obscurity, the different updates and events helped keep the community as active as it was for nearly 2 years when they finally broke the mold. Instead of releasing a separate title altogether, they dropped the Iceborne DLC expansion for $40, and it was worth
Every penny that you spent.
over 30 new monsters, 2 new areas, the Clutch Claw, new moves for every weapon, and what many felt like was an entire game's worth of content, if not more, to expand upon the original story of Monster Hunter World. Both World and Iceborne were delivered in a way that respects your investment as a player. Now, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this comparison, and while FromSoft has done DLC for Souls games like the recently released Shadow of the Erdtree, to me, these have always felt like extensions of content as opposed to a 1.5 expansion, making changes on the mechanics like Iceborne was for World, like 4 Answer did for 4, and so on. At this point, we know there's interest in continuing the series, and it's very possible the same could be done for Armored Core 6 before the 7th gen game is made, but ultimately, I'd still like to dive deeper into the base release of 6 and what could have been done for it. Now, before I do, I feel the need to acknowledge that Monster Hunter has always had a fanbase large enough to keep the game steadily afloat, while Armored Core and the mecha genre as a whole, despite its recent resurgence, have remained a bit niche no matter what form of media they take. So while I don't know the logistics behind the decisions made by FromSoft, if you look at Armored Core's numbers over time, I could understand why a company would be hesitant to go all in. Hell, Armored Core 6 by itself is close to beating the combined sales from the rest of the franchise. But the issue now is what's being done to keep the fan base it created. I'd argue that it feels like the Armored Core community has done more and is doing more to keep 6 alive than they have. Up until recently, the only sense of cooperative gameplay you could find would be in the form of 3v3 fights in the nest, and while I know a lot of people who enjoy the style of fighting, it wasn't everyone's cup of tea. Thankfully though, in March of this year, longtime modder Luke Yui released a co-op mod that also incorporates optional Souls-like invasions, giving PC players a taste of what they've been craving.
Just killed a couple loader 4s. Didn't feel good.
Oh, great! And while it's been an absolute blast, it still doesn't take away from the fact that this feels like it should have just been a base game feature so console players could be enjoying this as well. While we did get an unexpected update giving a rank system and everyone new parts, this still didn't really do much to improve the replayability if you weren't a PvP player. Without spoiling, the single-player campaign of Armored Core 6, while having an awesome story, is a very brief experience that left quite a few of us satisfied in many regards, but hungry for more in most others. And I can personally attest to that. Where I'd like to see Armored Core 6 be more like World isn't the game itself, it's acknowledging what your player base is about and creating a gameplay loop around this with sustainability. It's creating a foundation for the revamp of your series that makes it worth continuing to play. Hell, allow us mercenaries to form our own factions, driving the competitive scene, make a seasonal base format beyond a simple rank system with no incentive, something that appeals to both PvE and PvP players in a way where new people and friends could contribute to... Huh? Wait, they already did that? Oh wait, for real?
Yes, that's right. 10 years ago, there was a pretty well thought out system that was maybe just a tad bit ahead of its time.
We had both co-op and faction-based combat in the last generation of Armored Core that mixed elements of PvE and PvP into an all-out war with seasonal resets, allowing for players to band together and contribute in a variety of ways. Since I haven't played it myself, I actually spoke with some Verdict Day players to get some insight, and you could actually compare Verdict Day's multiplayer to the current model for Helldivers 2's gameplay. But instead of being one united force against different enemies, it's flipped around on its head as you choose between one of 3 factions that would compete for control over different regions of the world, with a 4th one sometimes working behind the scenes. This also brought about new overworld bosses that, if not for modding, would be impossible to fight right now since the servers were shut down as of March 31st this year. Now I want you to picture if we had this same template for 6. You choose between siding with RLF, Arquebus, or the Red Guns, with Overseer or Allmine being the occasional 4th faction while fighting in PvE and or PvP content in an attempt to have control over the Coral on Rubicon, with new enemies, mission types, boss raids, etc. This formula has the potential for limitless replayability. Oh, and for all us challenge run enthusiasts? Yeah, what if I were to tell you that there was not 1, not 2, but 10 pre-made challenge modes for the campaign that drastically changed the game? Want a riskier playthrough where the consequences are heavier? Attempt a Daredevil run and see if 10 ACs are enough to survive the 50% increase to the damage you receive.
Tired of being as bountiful as Bezos with your wealth?
Well, then try out the Money is Everything challenge where you'll really be feeling the heavy meme with that times 50 increase to ammo costs and 3 times more expensive repairs. Maybe you're wanting a little more payout, a little more high risk, high reward. Then try out the Gambler where you only have 5 ACs that take 5 times more damage, but also dish out 10 times more to the enemy. Meanwhile, the real hardcore players have Mr. Confident, Please Be Gentle, and one-shot kill, limiting you to 1 AC if you really want to test your knowledge of the game and prowess as a pilot. My point is that even if you're not someone who wants to keep up with the seasonal base system, there were still other means of replayability that appealed to the wider variety of gamers. Don't get me wrong, I understand their priorities were and are for the Elden Ring DLC. I just really hope that once they're done with the post-launch cleanup of inevitable bugs and patching that will come with Elden Ring's DLC, and before we ever get an Armored Core Vindictive Embers or whatever subname 7 would happen, that they pull through with an update that's significant enough to deliver to both the old Ravens who waited for over a decade and the new ones just taking flight for the first time. I really hope that they invest the time, love, and effort to make the contributions and patience their community has had over the years feel worth it. The foundation is there for FromSoft to build upon, and I'm hoping if we wait just a little bit longer, that we'll get that payout. Hey, thanks for watching. I've been wanting to do a more in-depth discussion video for a while now, but took my sweet time getting to it. Also, if you'd like to come and hang out during the live streams, I go live most days at 8 PM Central Time, though I'm hoping to start earlier soon. Links for everything will be in the description, including the Discord where you can come hang out, post your gunpla, join in on watch parties, suggest what to play next, and more. Outside of that, just thank you all for the support once again, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Peace!